of or haven't heard anything so far, we are talking about best practices when testing with React today. And so we can go ahead and get started. So real quick before we get into testing with React, I think it's good to go over some of the foundations of, why do we test our software, and so like the 5 W's of testing. So that's like why, what, when, where, that sort of thing. So like, if you were a manufacturer and you're manufacturing cars, you have to, by law, make sure that your airbags work. So you have to have tests for your airbags because you want to have confidence that people are going to be safe in your car. And we test our software for the same reason. We want our confidence that our software performs reliably and safely for consumers. So just keep that in mind as we're going. So this is a quote from Pinchy Dog. If you aren't familiar with Pinchy Dog, he is the authority on JavaScript testing. My friend Eric, he even calls him the man, the myth, the legend. Pinchy Dog. So one of his more famous quotes is, the more your tests resemble the way your software is used, the more confidence they can give you. Here is Kent. I'm not sponsored by him or anything. He has really great blog posts on any of your testing needs, basically, for the front end specifically. And I think some of his content is even good for the back end as well. A lot of kind of the principles he talks about and that sort of thing. Pinchy Dog said that quote, and kind of some examples of what he means by that are, let's say you have a RESTful API. Good tests for your RESTful API are going to resemble the way they're used. So, you think, okay, how is a RESTful API used? You're going to have a client, and it's going to ping that RESTful API and pull some data or post some data, that sort of thing. So your test should resemble how your client's using that backend, and that's a good test. Because the closer to how the user uses the backend your tests are, the better and the more confidence they give you. Because now, when you make changes in your application, you're going to know, oh, is this test failing? Is this test passing? That sort of thing. For the front end, it's a little different. We have, so for the front end, if you think about it in the same way. So we have end users or consumers, and they are the people who are using our front end. So whatever tests we have, we want it to match how our users are using our software. So that's kind of like the big idea that Dog is talking about. So now we know why we should test and what our tests in general should look like, but how specifically should we test React? So we could manually test React, but that's not a great idea because it is very expensive. I was actually reading in Uncle Bob's Clean Code that he worked at a company where every time they needed to test software, they would send it off to this testing agency, and it would cost $1 million every time. Yeah. This is towards kind of when software development was getting started, so they didn't have these kind of methodologies and principles yet. So they did make these kind of mistakes. So it's very expensive. It took a month to do every time, so it cost $1 million in a month. And it's very tedious, and people are testing, and people make mistakes. So people are going to, raise false negatives or false positives, and that sort of thing. So we know we don't want manual testing. We know we want automated testing because it's better in every single way that manual testing. It improves on everything that manual testing has disadvantages for. So instead of being expensive, it's really cheap. You get really quick feedback, which is very important for developers. So if you're developing this application and you make a change, you need to know if you broke something or not. If you have to wait a month, that's a big disadvantage. You're going to have to be really careful and really know. It's just not great. So the shorter feedback loops the developers can get, the shorter you can make that, the faster developers can iterate and improve on the software. And ideally, you only have to write your tests one time. In a dream world, it's probably not reality at all. While as manual testing, you're going to have to test it yourself each time. And it also helps prevent those human errors that we get for manual testing. So this leads to another question. Okay, so what testing library should you use? And it really depends, because there are so many different JavaScript libraries for testing, and there's also different kinds of testing. So there are 4 kinds of testing. There are end-to-end testing, there is integration testing, unit testing, and static testing. So just real quick, end-to-end, that's a robot clicking through your application, like how a user would click through your application. An integration test is testing multiple units of code. So in React, if you had 2 separate components, then an integration test would test that they work together correctly. And while a unit test would test one of those components in isolation. There's also static testing, which that's your linking tools, that's things that fix your spell check errors, your text editor has some of that built in, that sort of thing. This is the testing trophy, also from Pinchy Dog's blog. And I've also seen testing pyramids where it has kind of the same sort of idea, where at the bottom you have like unit tests or static testing, and then as you go up the pyramid, things both get more expensive and cost more time to maintain or run, etc. But what's interesting about the testing trophy is this is something that Pinchy Dog recommends, and he recommends more integration testing than unit testing. And I think kind of his reasoning is, well, if you have 2 different components, and you're testing them in isolation, and then also doing an integration test, oftentimes you can just do that integration test and get the same benefit as 2 unit tests and an integration test. So that's kind of the reason why he recommends that. And static testing is at the bottom. It's also extremely easy to implement and gives you a lot of benefits. So personally, it's pretty much always beneficial to improve or add static testing.
Is it fair to say that you can't test-driven development then?
Pinchy Dog.
So,
Here are
if you
2
didn't hear
options
that clearly,
for
the question
testing.
was,
There
does
are
Pinchy
other
Dog's practice
libraries
test-driven
as well.
development?
But,
At the time of the presentation, I
my
just
company, we
assumed
use
he did,
Cafe,
but after doing a little bit more
I've
research
also heard good
and
things
looking at
about
a tweet
Cypress,
that Kent
but I haven't used it myself.
sent out, it looks like he only does that about 5% of the time, and the rest of the time he writes his tests
Now for
after
unit or integration
implementation.
test, this is the library
So
that
he
Kent
thinks this is
recommends.
perfectly
I would
fine.
also recommend it as well.
Personally, I don't think it really matters.
Originally,
as
when I
long as
made
you
this
have those
meetup, we
tests
called
in
it,
there.
Kevin and I called it, like best practices testing with Enzyme. But as I was doing my research, I realized that Enzyme can encourage some bad practices, and that testing library might be a better choice. Testing library with it's not a test runner. It is like extra utilities you can use. So the reasons why Kent doesn't recommend Enzyme, and I wouldn't recommend it either, is that it turns out that JavaScript and JavaScript frameworks and CSS and HTML, all these tools we use to build the front end, they are all implementation details. And what that means is for our end users, they aren't looking at HTML, they aren't looking at CSS, they aren't looking at JavaScript. The way the front end is used, the way the users use the front end is they see a button, they see text, they see a checkbox. You know, they see elements, they see DOM nodes on the screen. They don't know what HTML is or JavaScript. So if our tests are testing HTML or JavaScript or CSS, you know, that isn't resembling the way our software is used. So again, React to an implementation detail. It doesn't resemble the way our software is used. Enzyme, what it allows you to do, if you aren't familiar, is it allows you to test like props in your React components. And the reason why that may not be best practice is because users don't care about React components. They have no knowledge of React components, so we don't. The reasoning, this kind of methodology, this reasoning is we don't care about what's inside the component. We care about what's actually rendering on the DOM. And this has several advantages. Some of the bigger advantages is that if you refactor a component and then the implementation is different, your test won't break because you're testing DOM nodes instead of testing implementation details in your React components. Now, if you mess up something in the implementation, actually kind of lost the train of thought right there.
Could I ask you something?
Yeah, sure.
What I'm hearing you say, correct me if I'm wrong, is like you're saying that testing the resulting HTML that's generated as opposed to testing that React components internally are communicating correctly.
Yes. For certain things, right? Like if you have maybe some utility functions or some other functions in general, you might want to have unit tests for that. But as far as UI testing, this methodology is saying it's a better idea to test the actual output of these components rather than testing the internal pieces of it. And that way, if you do refactor the component and the behavior is the same, your test doesn't break. So you don't have to rewrite your test. Because your test should break when your software isn't working anymore. Your test should break when that button isn't displaying anymore, not when the props inside the button change. So we don't care about that. We just care if the button displays and has the correct text. Some of these bullet points that I have on here, these are on the testing libraries. They have a page called like their guiding principles. And so they, these are some of their guiding principles. They prefer DOM nodes rather than component instances, which is why I would recommend it over Enzyme, because Enzyme allows you to test component instances. They recommend testing your software the way a user would use it, having very simple APIs, which they are pretty simple. We can look at some of the docs if we have time. And it also, because it doesn't allow you to have component instances, to test component instances, it forces you to have best practices. So just like our linting rules that, say, hey, you should use const, C-O-N-S-T, like const instead of var or let, depending on the situation. It just improves our software.
Can you give an example of what testing a DOM node looks like versus testing a component instance?
Yeah. Just like verbally, or do you want to like see?
Verbally.
Yeah. So the difference would be if you test a component instance, you are like testing sort of the internals of the component, like the inside of the component, versus DOM nodes, you're testing the actual output of the component. Does that kind of make sense? Or,
Maybe in code. Sorry.
yeah, we can look at the code.
It's kind of like when you're doing a whole car test idea, where it's like this would be like, hey, I can move the steering wheel when the car moves versus testing the specific steering column or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. It's like instead of testing that the airbag is made of a special has something special inside of it, you're just testing if the airbag works. Period. You're testing what is actually on the DOM, what is actually rendering, versus like mocking things. I guess that's kind of the big difference between the two is when you're testing component instances, you're kind of like mocking certain things. You're making certain assumptions rather than testing DOM nodes where you aren't making any assumptions. This is what is actually sent to the user, and what the user actually sees. We can look at the docs if we have time later. Let's see, we are at about 7. Okay, so we got about 30 minutes. We can look at some of the docs and look at the API. It's pretty straightforward. I also have one example on a nonprofit project that I've been working on using testing library that we can look at as well. Now, as far as static testing, kind of like I think the 3 more popular options are using TypeScript, ESLint, and Prettier. So all of these are really easy to install and add to your code base. If most of your code base is in JavaScript, it's really easy to migrate to TypeScript. The same thing with using ESLint and Prettier. It's really easy to install them and get it all set up. So ESLint, if you're familiar, it forces coding best practices, things like no magic numbers rule, which is a principle recommended by Uncle Bob in his book Clean Code. So one of his rules is instead of having like a timeout, let's say, and you just have the number 1000, it doesn't really give the developer any context versus if you replace that number 1000 with seconds until user logs in, then it's a lot more understandable and it's easier to maintain. So ESLint enforces that sort of thing. Prettier is a plugin for ESLint, and it gives you a set of coding formatting standards, which you may or may not agree with, but it's nice to just have one thing to just throw in your project. This is what we're doing. You may not agree with everything, but it's just an easy way to get consistent formatting across your project. If you haven't heard of TypeScript, it's going up on Stack Overflow. I think like 20 or 30%. I don't remember what it was measuring, but it's more people are using TypeScript. There really isn't a reason not to. Basically, all it does, if you're not familiar, is it makes JavaScript better by, let's say you have a function and you're accepting a string as an argument. Let's say login user, and you need a user ID. It's a string or a number. In JavaScript, the only way to verify if that's a string or a number is to have an if statement in that function. While it is in TypeScript, you can say this parameter is of type number. So you're guaranteed 100% of the time for that function to have a number, and you don't have to check. And it is also one of those things that's just proven to make your code quality better. Java has that's called static types. Java has that. C# Most backend languages do, and it just makes your code better. Is a good idea. So measuring testing is another thing that is important because if we care about something, we should try to measure it. And some people say, oh, you should try to get 100% line-by-line coverage, which I think is a little ridiculous. Actually, interestingly, Uncle Bob in the book FoCo, he also recommends this. He says you should shoot for 100% coverage. But I disagree, and I think a lot of developers do too. Pinchy Dog, one of the things he says is that after about, and this isn't a pure statistic, this isn't like, there aren't any statistics behind this, this is just, you just pull a number out of a hat. He said after about 70% line-by-line coverage, you get diminishing returns in your test. So it's definitely going to depend on the project, the scope of the project, and kind of where your application is for what numbers you want to shoot for. But in general, I think that any new code you add, if you just add tests for it, that you'll be solid. And another quick pointer about test coverage, just because your application has 100% line-by-line coverage doesn't mean it works like it should. Just because your test runner happens to hit all the lines doesn't mean your business logic was tested well enough. So the line-by-line coverage isn't like the Bible where it's like, yes, our application works 70% of the time because we have 70% coverage. You could have 70% coverage, and that could cover everything in your application, and it could, work perfectly fine. But there's something to keep in mind. So a few tips before I open up for questions. So if you aren't familiar with pre-commit hooks, they could possibly be beneficial for your app. So it's something where before you make a commit, it will run your unit tests or your integration tests, and basically force developers to iterate earlier and not, they, instead of a developer, they make a merge request and then it goes through a pipeline and then it fails, and then the lead dev says, hey, you need to fix this. It just takes more time and effort. It's a faster way for that developer to get feedback earlier. Don't use any in TypeScript. It defeats the purpose of TypeScript. Basically what that means is you're going back to default JavaScript where you don't know what the type is. And also anywhere you can force best practices, in your testing and your linting, that's going to just improve your code quality, and that's in general always a good idea. And that's about all I have. We can open up for questions, and then if we have extra time, we can go back and check out the API if you guys want. And if not, we can just hang out for like 20 minutes.
Yeah, so can you show an example React test where you test the DOM using DOM?
React testing is on.
Yeah, instead of using the testing the procedure, so you using the DOM directly.
Yeah, testing a component.
Yeah.
Instead of testing the DOM. Yeah.
Examples you don't have the library at all? Yeah.
Yeah, so if we go to Enzyme docs.
So the presentation pretty much ended around that time. There were some more questions, but most of those questions had to do with the differences between React testing library and Enzyme. And there was some confusion on some of the differences, so I did dig around a little bit more, did some more research, and I'm going to talk about that now for the listeners who are watching this on YouTube. So here on the screen, there are some solid examples of bad practices that Enzyme allows you to do, and I'm going to explain that right now. So just like earlier on in our presentation, the methodology and the principles that I'm following are from Pinchy Dog, and also a little bit from Uncle Bob too in his book Clean Code. So again, one of the big quotes from Kent is, "Our tests should resemble the way users use our software." And again, also another reminder, if you didn't pick it up very well, is that testing library is Enzyme. It does everything that Enzyme does, minus bad practices. So if you're using Enzyme and you follow all the best practices that Kent recommends, then that's fine, and you can totally do that. But personally, my opinion is you should use testing library if you can, if that's a good decision, because that is not allowing you or other developers from using those best practices. And we all know when we're forced to do that it just improves our code quality and so on and so forth. So we can go ahead and get into it. So right here on the left, I have a few bullet points for some best practices these are actually the guiding principles on the guiding principles page of the testing library docs. And so Kent is the author of this library. And the whole idea, these are their 3 guiding principles. So one of them, the first one, use DOM nodes over React instances. So the issue you run into when you use React instances, for example, you are testing the internal state of a component and you're creating an actual instance of that and checking that. The issue you run into is that you are now testing implementation details. So that's bad. And the reason that's bad is you got to think, how is a user using this component? We want to test that, and we want that test to fail if our user we want that test to fail if our user can't use that component correctly or isn't able to use that component. So how does a user use a React component, right? So, just like this web page that you see on the screen right here, how do I know to go to the recipes page? Well, there's a word that says recipes on the nav bar. That's how I navigate to it. I don't navigate to the recipes button because I think, oh, this is a React component, and I'm going to look in the state of that component, and then if recipes exists, then as a user, after I've done that, then I'll click on the recipes button. Like that isn't how people use software, or that isn't how people use the DOM or the browser. They look at DOM nodes, what is actually presented to them, the actual visuals. That's how they navigate around. So we want to use those DOM nodes because that's how people actually navigate around our site and what is actually shown to people, versus using component instances where it's to a user, they're imaginary. They don't know anything about them. It's just an implementation detail. I think again I kind of brushed over that you should test components in the way a user would use it. And also they think their APIs should be simple. I think their APIs are pretty simple. Here's an example on the screen. So you have a render method, you throw in a component, and then you get some stuff to use out of that. So this is an example of a good selector, get by text, because as a user, I see text on the screen. I understand text, and that's how I use the software. Is, oh, I know I need to click on this recipes button to go to the recipes page because I see the recipes text here. Let's see. Okay, so let's move on to some. So here's an example of the testing library. Here's some queries they have. I'm not going to go too into detail on this, but you know, you can look more into it on your own. So going into some bad practices that Enzyme has. So weak selectors. And when I say weak, I mean either they aren't very resilient, or let's see here. So here are some selectors like CSS selector. I don't think it's a great idea to select by CSS, but that's an option. Here is when things kind of turn south for selectors. So you can select by a React component constructor. And although this is really interesting to be able to select this way, it's not a great idea because, again, as a user, I don't know what a React constructor is. That's not how I'm using your software. So, you know, what kind of confidence does that test give you if you're testing, if you're selecting by a constructor, right? Does that give you a lot of confidence that you're selecting the right thing? To me, no, because you know it's you're using a constructor. You aren't selecting what actual UI is displaying on the page. So that's selectors. Shallow rendering is also not a great idea. So shallow rendering, it doesn't render child components. And this is kind of debatable. But Kent's idea is you shouldn't mock things as much as possible. He agrees, or he thinks that you should have more integration tests versus unit tests. So let's say you're rendering a component and it's this page right here. Yeah, there's some child components inside of that, possibly. Kent says you should render them. Enzyme, when you're using shallow rendering on that page component, you only render the HTML and none of the child components inside of there. So this, you know, it's, you know, you could have maybe one of your child components has an error, you know, and you're not going to know that unless you test your child component. But maybe the integration too between the two components, that has an error. And you aren't going to know unless you actually render that component. Now, shallow rendering is faster, but not like milliseconds faster than rendering a component on the DOM. Another thing the Enzyme does is it allows you to things like so it allows you to test things like .instance, .state. Here are three functions they have that aren't very good. So they're that find function, that the selectors in there that we already talked about. There's also this .state and .instance functions that you can use. So you can look at the state of a component, and you can also look at the instance of a component, and that gives you access to this keyword relative to that component. So basically allows you to look at this .state, this .props, that sort of thing. And again, that isn't a great idea to be testing those kinds of things, because you're testing, again, implementation details. You know, these just happen to be the way your front end is created. You just happen to be using React components. You know, the user doesn't know anything about .state. They don't know anything about .instance. So if your tests are testing .state, testing .instance, it doesn't give you confidence that your component is actually functioning correctly. It gives you confidence that those methods in there are functioning correctly, not that your component that is actually rendering is functioning correctly. So those are a few examples of some bad practices that Enzyme allows. Kent does have several blog posts on, for example, shallow rendering and Enzyme. They go into more detail than I did here, but as a more high-level overview, that's the big idea. So testing library, the whole reason, Kent's whole motivation for creating the testing library was to move away from these things. So in the testing library, it does have less, but sometimes less is more. And it doesn't allow you to do these bullet points. So that because of that, your tests are going to give you more confidence. They're going to be more reliable, and they're going to be more maintainable. And again, if you want, you can still use Enzyme, and if you follow best practices using Enzyme, that's great. I think at the least it's good to just know why these are bad practices according to Kent, and to avoid those. So thank you for your time watching my presentation in this video. I hope you learned something new. I am going to create a blog post version of this video, and so feel free to subscribe here or on my blog to follow more content like this, and I'll see you in the next one. Hey, thanks for watching. Hit that bell to see more videos like this, and also feel free to visit my blog where I have other videos and posts about content like this. Feel free to also leave a comment, and I can potentially get to any questions you have, answer any questions, and potentially make videos on that. Whatever I can do to be helpful, I'd love to do for you. But anyways, again, thanks for watching. My name is Alex Cannon, and I'm out.